We're going to start on time. So this is a special call, and remember, this is live streaming in the group as well. And years ago, I reached out and found this incredible trauma therapist that absolutely changed my life. And it's been years now, and so I reached out and asked if she would present and talk about trauma, because when we're looking at ADHD, as we know in the calls, ADHD doesn't cause trauma, or sorry, trauma doesn't cause ADHD, and it can turn the volume up on our ADHD symptoms, and there's some overlap. And so if you've experienced trauma, or if you have a client who's gone through it, or a family member or anything, by being a bit more trauma informed or understanding how it shows up, and working through that, if that's something that affects you, it can actually help with ADHD and just overall wellness. So I reached out to the trauma therapist. She'd agreed to come on, and yeah, I've been very excited for this. So her name's Colette Lord, and she's going to take over the call, and she's going to present on this. She's a specialist in this, PhD on trauma. I'll let you give your bio, and then she'll have time for some Q&A at the end, right, Colette?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
awesome. All right, so I'm going to turn over. So this is Colette Lord. I'll let her give her bio, and then she's got an incredible presentation for us, and I have a handout that I'll send out after as well.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I very much appreciate it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I just organize everything better if I do a PowerPoint. So that's what we're going to do. There we go. So hi, my name is Dr. Colette Lord. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And as Tyler so graciously said, I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of California. I'm a certified EMDR therapist and consultant, a diplomat of the American Academy of Experts in Traumatic Stress, and a certified transgender care therapist. And because most people want to know this about me, in the bottom right-hand corner, you will see Sadie, who is my therapy dog and comes with me to all of our sessions and is sometimes considered my junior therapist. So she can't be on the call with us today, but there's a little bit of her for you. So I have a lot of information. There's so much that I could present on today. So I will just try to go through all of it without speaking a mile a minute. And as Tyler said, have some time at the end for question and answer. And then you'll have my contact information there at the end as well. If you guys want to anyone wants to reach out to me afterwards with questions, I always welcome that. So a little bit on how I wanted to talk about trauma today. So I really want to talk about trauma from the kind of subjective experiential perspective. I'm not going to talk about trauma from a diagnostic perspective. What are the official symptoms that you need to meet a particular criteria, although that can be really important. To me as a therapist, what's really important is for people to understand how trauma is showing up in their lives, in their day-to-day, in their relationships. So I'm not going to necessarily talk about the criteria that you'll need to meet for PTSD, borderline personality disorder, or dissociative identity disorder, as those are kind of like the big three that we typically identify as coming with trauma. And another reason for that is because you'll see these symptoms can show up in all sorts of ways and can get all kinds of diagnosed and misdiagnosed and crossover with diagnosis. So I just want you to be able to recognize kind of what's going on from, your own personal experience without worrying so much about the particular label that we're talking about. And so another question that often comes up is, what is trauma? What causes trauma? And unfortunately, so much can be a cause of trauma. So things that shouldn't have happened to you that did happen can cause trauma. Car accident, an assault, a natural disaster, those abuse obviously can cause trauma, as well as things that didn't happen that should have happened. Neglect, not getting your basic needs met, not getting food, shelter, clothing, being seen and validated for who you are. Those are all things that developmentally should happen for people. And if they don't, it can cause lasting trauma. Experiences that are too much, too soon, or too intense for us and our physiology at the time can cause trauma. We know from research, micro and macroaggressions based on identity. So, racism, homophobia, transphobia, all of those things can really show up as trauma in a person's lives and cause lasting effects. And then maybe some things that you wouldn't necessarily automatically assume would be traumatic, but hospitalizations, both voluntary and involuntary, can be experienced as traumatic. Going through a major depressive episode can actually be experienced as traumatic. Unwanted medical procedures or medical procedures that you maybe go through as a child and just don't understand, but you did need, can be experienced and stored as trauma. Another one that we're seeing more and more is witnessing trauma or the aftermath, particularly via social media. That can be incredibly traumatic for folks. And so trauma is individual and personal, and it's the meaning we often make from the experiences that keep it stuck as trauma. And so that's why I really want to focus on the personal kind of lived experience. So a little bit about kind of trauma and the brain. From my theoretical perspective as an EMDR therapist, I believe that our brains have a natural drive towards health and healing. And so when something traumatic happens, that natural drive is thwarted. So typically what we see, something upsetting happens, we talk about it. We think about it. We gain support about it. We dream about it. And eventually the brain processes that and kind of puts it as just one moment in our story, in the narrative of our lives. And that's how healthy, normal memory is processed. But when a trauma happens, there's this cascade of chemical changes that happen in the brain that can prevent the brain from processing that experience the way it would normally. And brain scans will actually show that traumatic memories are stored in what we consider an activated state. So they hold their intensity regardless of how much time has passed. And that's why you can't just get over trauma, which is something you'll hear people say sometimes, both to each other and to ourselves. So as I said, the brains hold on to those memories as intense. Each element, the sights, the sounds, the emotions, the sensations, all remain vivid and are reactivated every time the brain sees something else and categorizes it as similar. And because it's activated, because it was considered kind of life or death, the brain assigns heightened importance to whatever it learned via the trauma. So other information gets filtered out. The positive experiences, the neutral experiences aren't as relevant in the brain's processing of these events because our brains are oriented in those moments towards, threat, towards life and death. And that's why it stays in this really unhealthy activated state. And that's why it takes a lot to get it processed after it's been in the brain for a while and hanging out. So these are kind of the different categories of experiences and how trauma can show up in our lives that I'm going to go through each one of these in more detail. But there's a hypersensitive threat response system. There's elevated levels of baseline arousal and reactivity, changes in the way we think about ourselves, others, and the world, changes in our emotional lives, intrusive or distressing memories that can come up, attachment issues, and dissociative experiences. And I'm going to just pause here for a second because I realized I like to say, what we're talking about today is trauma. If you do find that it feels like this is activating or disturbing in any way, please just, take care of yourselves. We never know what's going to cause us to feel a little bit kind of something about stuff that has happened in our past. So please don't feel like, you have to stick around if this is triggering. Take care of yourselves in this process. So.
And we'll send out the slides and the recording and the notes.
Yep.
And so like one thing that she said is so important is like you can't, you don't have to push yourself or rush through like healing or trauma. You really, it's like consent based with yourself. And so we don't require Zoom to be on. If you feel like you want to turn that off, if you feel emotional, if it just feels a little raw, just again, yeah, whatever you need to do. And we will send out the slides, the recording, and the notes if you feel dysregulated and you need to take a break.
Yeah, please, please, please always take care of yourself. All right. And so a caveat about kind of the symptoms or the, experiential stuff that I'm about to talk about, as far as how trauma shows up in our lives, is that a lot of times I will be speaking of these things as changes, changes to our baseline, changes from before to after the trauma. And that is a very easy, convenient way to talk about trauma. However, the more traumatic experiences you've been through, and the earlier those experiences started, the harder it might be for you to identify a before and after. Because if it started early enough, you may not have a verbal memory to reference of before. And so just kind of keeping that in mind, we talk about before and after for ease, but just because you can't identify a before doesn't mean it's not a valid traumatic experience or reason for you to be this way. So I just kind of want to throw that out there too. All right, so hypersensitive threat response system. And so what we usually think about when we're talking about threat response system is the fight or flight. It's actually much bigger than that, and I'll go over more of that. But the fight or flight response is your body's physiological response to threat. And that physiological response, that perception of threat that your brain is doing, that your nervous system is doing, happens before conscious thought. And this is really, I want to pause on this. It happens before conscious thought. You are not responsible for how your physiology decides to respond to threat. And that is super important because a lot of times we beat ourselves up for how we responded in the moment and we don't understand why. And there's a lot of self-blame that can happen. And that's such a big part of what I really want to come from this presentation is just a better understanding and compassion for yourself on why you maybe responded the way that you did or respond the way that you do. We need to have more self-compassion throughout this process so that we can heal, because being hard on yourself for what you do and how you do it does not help. It doesn't help you heal. So, and again, depending on how many of these traumatic experiences you've been through and how early they started, you can kind of find that you're either hypersensitive, that always ready almost to go into fight or flight, or it can feel simply that the switch is always on. And that can be incredibly exhausting. And so that means that your nervous system might respond to any kind of threat as life or death. So I feel threatened in my personal relationship that I might lose this person because I've upset them. My body and my brain might respond as though that is life or death, even though you consciously know that's not what you're worried about. So again, just kind of, I want there to be empathy for ourselves and our responses. So the two most commonly well-known responses that the brain can make is the fight or flight. And so it usually the nervous system is judging kind of based on any one particular set of circumstances, but you can also find that you may tend towards the fight style of responding or the flight style. But the fight response, obviously, if the nervous system believes that you can fight your way out of this life or death situation, that's what it will show up as. So it can look like physical, actual fighting, but in more kind of chronic states, it can look like a verbal combativeness and irritability and argumentativeness. Flight. Generally, we think that the first response that the nervous system goes through is, okay, can I fight my way out? If not, okay, can I flee? Can I run away from this situation? And that can look obviously like physically running away, but it can also look more chronically like avoidance. It can look like moving across the country to get away from a situation. It can look like taking flight in the mind. So you're checking out mentally. So you may be physically here, but your brain has left the building. That's flight as well. And then the other less well-known responses of the system are freeze, fawn, and faint. So freeze, that's if we think that we can't get out of the situation. It stereotypically, it's looking like the deer caught in the headlights. It's a literal freeze, lack of motion, frozen like a statue. But it can also be a mental freeze where you feel like you're not really able to speak or respond or move the body in a way that makes sense. And it just looks like you're shut down. The fawn response is when this response happens when we feel like, okay, again, not making a conscious decision about this, but when the nervous system judges that the threat might be appeased, minimized, or avoided if we cooperate, if we give in to the demand, if we try to go along to get along. It can, and chronically, that can look like people pleasing or a hyper focus on meeting someone else's wants or needs because that's how you learned you were going to gain safety, right? And then when all else fails, the nervous system response is faint, play dead, loss of consciousness. And that might look like fainting or other kind of loss of consciousness, but it can also be like an extreme sudden urge to sleep. It's an escape into sleep. It's a shutting down of all of the systems. And so these are the main ways that our threat response system can react. And you'll be able to see that as I talk about some of the other lived experiences, the way these symptoms can show up. But this threat response system underlines a lot of the ways that trauma shows up in our lives. So elevated levels of baseline arousal and reactivity. So this is also can kind of be thought about as hyperarousal, if you've heard that term, but it's the system, both mentally and physiologically, is aroused. It is on, it is vibrating, it is ready to react, and that can look like a chronic irritability and angry outbursts, usually out of proportion to the situation, both that you recognize that and that others recognize that. And so that might be a kind of a chronic response. Hypervigilance is another really big one. And this is being chronically alert for danger. You might be uncomfortable with people standing behind you in line or wanting to always be seated with your back against the wall, constantly having your head on a swivel, or interpersonally, it might look like being on high alert for signs of betrayal, abandonment, or disrespect in your relationships. It's, the brain is just, it's ready and it's looking and it's scanning always for these signs. But elevated arousal then can also lead to a lot of difficulty with falling or staying asleep and restless, interrupted sleep. And that's because your nervous system is in overdrive. You're making it difficult for your brain to both rest and the threshold for your startle response to be much lower. Because again, you're ready to fight or flee or whatever you need to do at a moment's notice. So one of the ways that this can kind of show up or maybe get a little bit confusing with ADHD is there can be problems with concentration and focus because of this reactivity, because the brain is so focused on looking for signs of threat and potential danger that you're not necessarily able to focus on the task at hand. And so all of these different ways of being reactive and kind of on alert often comes with people trying to regulate that reactivity and that arousal through less than healthy coping strategies, use and abuse of substances, prescription medications, self-harming, unhealthy spending, risky sexual behavior, gambling. A lot of those addictive type behaviors often start out as an attempt to cope, an attempt to regulate ourselves, and then they unfortunately take on a life of their own and cause other problems. But again, I want there to be some understanding and empathy for maybe why that started as the best option in a bad situation to manage some of this reactivity. All right, so changes in our ways of thinking about ourselves, others, and the world. And this is a biggie. This is really about the meaning that we're kind of making of whatever we've been through. And so a lot of times, unfortunately, we go through a trauma and we develop these persistent, exaggerated beliefs or expectations about ourselves, others, and the world. And these are conclusions that we come to, like, I'm bad. It's not safe to love. The world isn't safe. And the reasons that these are problematic, because maybe it's true that you learned that that person wasn't safe to love, but our brain generalizes that to it's not safe to love, and it becomes this all or nothing and gets activated even if we know it isn't necessarily logical. You know, these, especially the earlier these things happen, they kind of get laid down like templates for how we approach the world, and it can be really dysfunctional. The other side of things is having distorted beliefs about the causes and consequences of the trauma, which can lead us to blame ourselves or others for what happened. And again, these are distorted because they don't place the blame appropriately on the shoulders of whoever perpetrated the trauma. So instead of, believing it's the fault of the drunk driver who was behind the wheel, that's whose fault our accident was. It's my fault for having gotten in the car. And again, so that's why it's distorted. And again, these things, they get in our brains, they get laid down as these really heightened importance templates and totally change the way we approach the world and can be really, really problematic. Changes in our emotional lives. Unfortunately, again, what you will find is that maybe you have a hard time both accessing positive emotions, being able to feel happy, joy, contentment, and persistent negative emotional states. Fear, horror, anger, guilt, shame. Shame is a big one. And these problems, feeling positive and kind of chronic negative emotions, can often then lead folks to be less interested in participating in life and feeling estranged from others, because it's, if I can't experience joy, it's really hard to go out and participate with people who are enjoying life. And then it's hard to, it's just, it leads to more and more it can lead to more social isolation. And then, unfortunately, a common way people choose to try to start regulating those feelings are, again, through use of substances and other unhealthy coping strategies: self-harm, unhealthy spending, promiscuous sexual behavior, gambling, spending, all of the things. And again, I do say changes, but this might be chronic and you might not be able to identify a time from before. But the more chronic these things are, the more we should have a question in our mind of, okay, is there a reason? Maybe some stuff has happened. Maybe some stuff has happened that I'm not allowing myself to really acknowledge was impactful. Intrusive or distressing memories or dreams. This is unwanted memories coming up at any and all times. Flashbacks, which are a more, kind of a reliving of an experience. Bad dreams, nightmares, night terrors, whether or not they directly relate and are kind of reminiscent of traumatic experience, or whether they're just kind of thematically the same, people coming after you, that kind of thing. And then the memories, whether they're in waking or dreaming life, are usually come with a lot of unpleasant mental and physical distress symptoms. Attachment issues are another big one, especially if trauma has happened in younger years. And so attachment is the interpersonal bond between a child and their caregiver that's developed through the accumulation of all of the successes and failures in the caregiving relationship, in the caregivers meeting the child's needs for physical and emotional care. So with what we call good enough parenting, because it doesn't have to be perfect, but good enough parenting where the parent, for the most part, is able to meet the child's needs for physical and emotional care, that develops into a secure attachment in adulthood, which means that you can feel connected with others and you know how to ask for and receive support from emotionally appropriate people in healthy ways. Well, when a secure attachment doesn't happen, when that good enough parenting doesn't happen, in adulthood, you'll see one of two things, either an anxious attachment style, which is where you feel rarely, you don't feel securely connected. You frequently are anxious about the relationship or how your partner or partners feel. And there's frequent reassurances sought about the relationship, but the reassurance doesn't really tide the person over. It never really satisfies because it's not truly about the other person or the relationship. It's that those deep-seated, I'm not enough kind of beliefs or, that sort of thing. And then on the other side is an avoidant attachment style, which is where the person doesn't feel comfortable with too much connection. Too much closeness feels threatening and scary. So it feels safer and more comfortable to have distance and space in the relationship. And what's really unfortunate is when someone who has an attachment style pairs up with someone with an avoidance style, because the anxious person is constantly seeking the closeness and reassurance, which makes the avoidant person feel uncomfortable and pull away, which makes the other person more anxious. The good news is that these aren't immutable, unchangeable attachment styles. They can change with time, experience, and therapy, but just kind of as a general approach, there's problems. It can cause a lot of trouble in relationship. And then there's also dissociation is another big piece that can happen. And dissociation is basically, in essence, a process or a symptom of disconnection. So we can disconnect and dissociate from our emotions, memories, physical bodies, perceptions, and I'll give examples of all of these, thoughts, and even ourselves. And so there are very common normative dissociative experiences that most of us have. So I'm an avid reader, and when I read, I disconnect from everything going on around me. And my husband can talk to me, and I won't necessarily hear him or even know that it's happened. And it takes more to interrupt and kind of reconnect me to the world around me. That's a normative, usual dissociative experience. And then it's also really normal and normative for our brains to disconnect in the midst of a traumatic experience as a protection from a painful reality. So these things can be really normal. The problem is when dissociation becomes super frequent without conscious awareness and is continually used, and that leads to disruptions in our sense of self and in our experiences. So dissociation from our emotions can look like being able to talk about this really painful thing that happened to me back when I was a kid, but not feeling in any way emotionally connected, not really allowing ourselves to fully sit with the emotional reality of how terrible that was for us. If we dissociate from our memories, we can find that, we don't remember all or part of a traumatic experience. And, the more traumatic things that have happened, I have folks who don't remember large chunks of their childhood. That can show up. That's a big red flag for trauma, by the way, having a lot of blank spots for childhood. Dissociation from the body can lead us to not feel pain or injury, which can be super dangerous. And it can also lead to people not knowing or feeling when they're hungry, when they're thirsty, or even when they need to use the restroom. Again, that can lead to a lot of physiological problems. Dissociation from our perceptions can lead us to having, we call them depersonalization or derealization experiences. So that's, the world around us can appear foggy, or like we're looking through a kind of a veil or a screen. The world can feel unreal. Parts of ourselves can feel unreal, and those can be both kind of transitory experiences or more chronic experiences. And then last but not least, we can dissociate from ourselves. And this leads to fragmentation of self, or having really disconnected or distinct sides or self states, ego states, alters, whatever word you want to use. But so there's a lot of different ways that dissociation can show up in our lives, especially with trauma. So, well, okay, so I will, a couple things I wanted to say about ADHD and trauma. And so there's a whole mess of information out there. So I just really wanted to distill it down, and then I'll share a screen that Tyler shared with me that I thought was useful. But so trauma-related symptoms, such as motor restlessness, emotional instability, and concentration problems, can all mimic and look like and exacerbate and be confused with ADHD symptoms. And so you really got to be careful, both for yourself and talking with providers, and just know that as therapists, it can be really hard. And as people, it can be really hard to know chicken or egg, what, is this symptom only because of this or because of that? And it sometimes takes trial and error, and sometimes it just being asked the right questions or knowing the right questions to ask ourselves that might be able to help us differentiate. But I just want to validate that that can be really confusing, and there can certainly be gaslighting both ways from providers and clinicians. Folks with ADHD are at increased risk of traumatic experiences due to impulsivity or inattention. They can also be targeted by others in the systems because of the inattention and being othered for those issues in school and in systems of care that don't understand and are really rather punitive still. We know that from research that there's a correlation between abuse and ADHD. Again, not knowing necessarily which way is which, but they definitely come. There's been associations there. And I know I said I wouldn't talk a lot about diagnosis, but we know that PTSD, the main trauma-related diagnosis, if someone has PTSD, they're 80% more likely to meet diagnostic criteria for at least one other mental health issue, one of which might be ADHD. So let's see. Okay, I'm doing good on time. So this is the infographic that Tyler shared, and I liked it, on how symptoms of ADHD and PTSD show up, and where things are both kind of more related to one or the other, and where they overlap. Now, I myself am the one who added the little red ellipses because I think these are maybe a little bit more overlapping. So for the ADHD present in childhood, you can't say that PTSD isn't, related to childhood, and trauma might have happened in childhood. So it could show up super early and we just don't know. And again, social difficulties related to picking up on social cues, that can, depending on kind of how PTSD and how the trauma is showing up in a person's life, that can very much kind of look the same in PTSD. And then as far as on the other side, PTSD with the negative and rigid core beliefs about self in the world, well, I was thinking that, those can absolutely develop because of messages you get if you have ADHD, particularly in academic settings. But then I think that's because of the trauma related to the messaging that you're getting anyway. So that, I would remove that last circle on the right. But as you can see, there's a lot of overlap. And it's the irritability, impulsivity, working memory, so much that can really lead to folks being misdiagnosed and kind of confusion back and forth. But I thought that was a lovely infographic and wanted to include that here. Did you have anything you wanted to say about that, Tyler?
Yeah, there's so much. This was the best graphic. I mean, I looked at so many of them, and there's
I know.
so much, and I love what you did there. There's so much misinformation out there. There are specialists I mean, even people follow that say, trauma causes ADHD. Which it absolutely doesn't if you read all the medical studies. Yeah, there's just a lot of overlap in there, and it's kind of piecing stuff together. And then also, just as a side note, I know we have the label of ADHD. It's really the neurodivergent community. And so for
Yeah.
some reason, and I don't think there's anybody on this call, but if for some reason you found out that it's more trauma versus ADHD, you're still part of the community. If you have it, if you have a spouse that has it, a kid, you just want to be there for a client. So I want to make that clear. If anybody's hearing this and thinking, whoa, I might have a lot more trauma, maybe a little bit of ADHD. I just want to make sure that it doesn't mean you're out, right? You don't have to have a diagnosis of ADHD to be a part of it. But yeah, I mean, we had just two things I want to mention. We'll do some Q&A at the end, but basically, yes, there are trauma specific therapists that you can get, and we can help reach out because I mean, she and I worked together for a few years, and it was probably the most significant work I've done, more than a coach, more than a training, more than anything I've ever done for my business was addressing trauma. So I'll throw it back to you. And
Okay.
yeah, this is great.
Thanks. Thank you. Yeah. And really, get I love the fact that you have this community to kind of be talking and figuring things out and normalizing, and just kind of getting curious and digging in because there is so much misinformation out there and just lack of understanding and empathy all around in so many ways. But if you can get the help that you need, whether it's a little bit or a lot for the ADHD or the PTSD, the better human you will be. And a lot of times, unfortunately, it is going to require help of some kind to get there. And so I think a lot of times we think we can self-help our way through it or read enough books through it. Not so much as the time there needs to be at least some level of community and other, whether that's professional. And of course, I'm going to be biased and have a preference for that, but community, others you can talk to, and kind of get a handle on things. So
Now, and I'll add one thing to that. So a lot of us can be like high achievers, right? Very learning based. We want to move fast. We can be impatient with ADHD. With trauma, and this was a big lesson I learned, you don't want to flood the system and just say, okay, I'm gonna just, you know what, I'm gonna get the books, right? I'm gonna get the books. I'm just gonna knock this out. I'm just gonna heal this trauma. I'm ready to be done with it. You can actually flood the system and like traumatize yourself. And so whether you're doing it by yourself, it's really paying attention to your nervous system and not flooding it and watching what's happening in your body. And the other thing, I'd been through other therapists before I had worked with her before, with Colette, and really pay attention to how you feel because sometimes we can put therapists on a pedestal, which some of them are great, and that would make sense. And we don't trust ourselves. And I had experiences prior to that where I was feeling uncomfortable or dysregulated and I wasn't being listened to. And then I was told like, that's what you're supposed to do, or oh, this is letting anger out, but really I was having a panic attack. And so when you're seeking a trauma therapist, which you can always message me and I can help point you to how to find that. If you do that, pay attention to your body. It's hard, it's intense, but you should feel better after and calmer. And there should almost be like a cathartic feeling, but you need to feel safe. And if you're working with a trauma therapist and you don't feel ready to go into something and you say, hey, I'm not ready for that, they need to respect that. And if they don't, that's a red flag. If they push you into something and you feel like you're not ready, huge red flag. Do not race through this. Because you've got to be able to have boundaries and feel safe. If they don't have good boundaries, if they share too much personal stuff, I mean, be very, 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 very picky when you work with a trauma therapist. That's what I want to throw out
yes.
there. And so I'll pull back. I just want to read, because some people will work on this and it's not the right person, or they push them too hard, and then it's like you shut down, you never want to do it again. So
Yeah.
anyways, I'll hand it back to you. I just want to throw
Okay.
that out there.
Yes, I really so much appreciate that, because it can be the best, topmost, trauma specialist. And if they are not listening to you and don't feel right to you, then they are not the number one trauma therapist for you. And that is 100% okay. And if they are a decent, therapist, they will absolutely understand that. And it sucks to have to interview and like feel therapists out, but you do, because you got to find one that fits for you. So 100% on all of the kind of things that Tyler just shared about finding the right therapist. So I think it's obvious why we need to talk about trauma. And I would hope from all of these various ways that trauma can impact you, that it should be obvious. But this is a question that comes up. So I want to spend a little bit more time on it and go into a little bit more of, why we need to talk about trauma. But it 100% impacts our mind, body, and spirit of any and all of us. Um, and if we don't acknowledge the role that trauma has played in how we got to now, then we tend to blame ourselves harshly for things that were set in motion long ago that we didn't necessarily have a choice in, or that we don't necessarily have control over now. And we fail to correctly identify the thing that needs to be addressed. And so if we are just, saying, okay, everything is ADHD, that's all I got to figure out, then finding the right medication should be, not necessarily always, but could be a huge help. And then if we're on the meds and nothing is changing, that needs to, maybe we're not addressing the thing that needs to be addressed. I mean, it's super complicated and not necessarily always that easy to see one to the other, but yeah, if we're not finding the things that are actually wrong, we're not going to address the things that we need to. And then there's a huge impact on our society and on our family systems. And just, I think, I think we're just that is being thrown in our face more and more, is we're seeing the results of an unhealthy kind of society based on a lot of trauma and trauma responding. But one of the big research studies that really kind of blew this open, and it always surprises me when people aren't aware of this, because it was so groundbreaking, was called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, the ACEs study. And it was one that was done through Kaiser Permanente here in San Diego. And I forget, I want to say it was like 20,000 people were involved in it. So it's a very robust, over many years kind of research study that has clearly, consistently, and repeatedly demonstrated that there's a link between adverse childhood experiences, and I'll go into that in a second, and later health, social, and behavioral problems. And so the more of these adverse experiences, or ACEs, that we go through, the greater the incidence of these negative outcomes. So in this study, they didn't obviously look at all types of trauma, but what they looked at were verbal and emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, parental divorce and separation, witnessing domestic violence, drug or alcohol abuse in the home, mental illness in the home, or having a household member go to prison. So there are plenty of places online you can go, check it off, see how many categories of ACEs you have experienced in your life. So the more ACEs, the more likely you are to have toxic stress, which negatively affects a child's brain development, their immune systems, and stress response systems, which can affect a child's attention, decision-making, and learning. So the more of these ACEs that you experience, the more likely you are to be at risk of cancer, lung disease, stroke, diabetes, smoking, COPD, cardiovascular disease, chronic pain, and pregnancy complications. But wait, there's more. There's also poor academic achievement, other mental health diagnoses like depression, anxiety, and PTSD, using tobacco products, misusing prescription medications, experimenting with drugs and highly addictive substances, increased engagement in high-risk behaviors, participating in high-risk sexual behaviors, teen pregnancy and paternity, sexually transmitted diseases, attempting suicide and self-harm, and involvement in sex trafficking. So, unfortunately, the ACEs are common. 64% of US adults have reported they've experienced at least one type of ACE before the age of 18. And nearly 1 in 6 reported they experienced 4 or more. It does not surprise me, but it is horrifying to know what the actual numbers are. And then, of course, we know intersectionality matters. So some people are at greater risk of experiencing ACEs than others. So we know if you're a cisgender female, you're more likely to experience ACEs. If you're a non-Hispanic American Indian or Alaskan Native adult, more likely. And adults who are unemployed or unable to work are more likely to have experienced more of these. And so they did these studies across Bermuda, Canada, and the US at this point, and they estimate the health consequences of ACEs are $748 billion annually. That's insane. And the fact that we aren't talking about it more just blows my mind and just gets me so upset. But so when people try to minimize the impact of trauma, whether it's on themselves or if it's on family members or if it's on people, like, think about that. Just think about the cost to yourself, to others. It is huge, and it absolutely 100% deserves attention and care. So, trying to figure out what to say about some of my keys to healing. And again, as I've said from the beginning, understanding and self-compassion, I think, are so, so huge. The past matters because it's how we learn, it's how we make sense of the world, it's how we approach things. And if we don't address that with compassion, we're not going to change. And the more you can try to approach this within yourselves and within relationships that you care about from a place of curiosity, it helps us from getting stuck in judgment and criticism and blame. Can we be curious about, why am I feeling this way? Why am I doing that? I wonder why I'm responding that way. The more we can stick to that, the healthier the response is at least likely to be. Then there's flexibility and balance. So sometimes what happens is we get, super rigid in kind of our ways of trying to heal. And I got to do this and this and this in order to heal. And it always has to be this and this and this. But the more flexibility we have in being able to respond to ourselves and our needs, the better. And you can't, big one when we first get into this work is a lot of times is kind of like Tyler was saying, I gotta go do it all and heal this. But we cannot be our own self-improvement project 24/7, or you will burn yourself out on healing and possibly re-traumatize yourself. So the more flexibility and balance we can get with that, the better. Befriending the body. We have to know what's going on in our bodies, because that is where so much of our trauma is stored, and so many of these problematic relationships start in how we relate to ourselves and our bodies. And then patience, 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 patience. I so wish that healing could happen quickly, but it usually doesn't. Doesn't mean that you can't start feeling better soon, but healing is going to be a lifelong thing if you want it to be, if you want it to stick. Because I'm always healing. There's always ways in which I can still improve and respond better. And then, just since so much of what I do is work with people with interpersonal trauma, I do want to put a little PSA out there that you do not need to forgive people in order to heal. Because that is something that you will hear a lot. And, Forgiveness is everyone's individual choice, but I don't want you to feel like you're not going to be able to forgive unless or you aren't going to be able to heal unless you forgive, because that's not true. And that can keep people stuck. So I just like to throw that. And then I was trying to think of all of the different ways to tell you you could find help. And these are just a fraction of some of the ways and things. But my version of the type of therapy I do is EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy. It started out as a trauma therapy, so that's kind of a big go-to, as is somatic experiencing therapy, because it also focuses on the body. Equine therapy, doing therapy with horses, has become a big one that can do some really good things. Dialectical behavior therapy, it was developed for folks with borderline personality disorder, but has some really great kind of coping skills and strategies for understanding ourselves in relationships. Any kind of trauma support group is often good. Again, you got to find one that fits for you. Things like neurofeedback, biofeedback, heart rate variability training, trauma-informed yogurt, yoga.
Trauma-informed yogurt, there's a product.
Oh, I would be rich. And engaging community of any kind is usually good, because we tend to, pull back when we've been through trauma. So there are a ton more other things, but I just kind of wanted to give a little bit of smattering of ways that you can at least begin to think of finding help. And then if you want to reach out to me, please, I prefer email. I get back to people faster that way. And there's my email. You can find me on Instagram or Facebook. I'm never on Facebook. All my stuff shares there. Don't try to interact with me there, or it'll be crickets. And then my website and my phone, my work phone. So that is it. I will unshare. I'm so glad. Thank you all for having me. I'm super passionate about this. I think this is kind of why I was put on this earth, is to do this work. And so I love being able to kind of spread information and be a resource. And so I was really excited to be invited on here. And please, 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 if you have questions, feel free to reach out. And then, yeah, I'm happy to work with Tyler and kind of giving some suggestions on websites and questions to ask. But if you want to reach out directly to me too, that's always welcome.
Um, yeah, well, you guys are incredible, and so that's amazing. Thanks for staying on the call, and message me. So I'll get with Colette. If we want more around this, we can do more. And what I would say, if there's anybody right now, like, besides finding a therapist, being gentle with yourself. Like, if this has brought stuff up, the best thing you can do tonight, like ever, is be really gentle with yourself whenever trauma comes up. Is like, take a hot bath, drink hot tea, watch a show that makes you laugh, hug your dog, go for a walk in nature, like, do something that's loving yourself. Because I did really intense trauma work for years with her. I mean, and she's like we went deep in that stuff, and that was a really incredible habit to put in place whenever stuff comes up, and that can help you heal faster. Like, being gentle and loving yourself is like one of the fastest ways to heal, if that makes sense. Versus like putting salt in the wound and say, suck it up, don't think about it. It doesn't really work like that. So if you have a wound, like, love yourself, and it will help it heal faster. So that's what I want to throw out there. So yeah, my inbox, message me on Facebook. It's always open. You are all so cared about so much. And yeah, if you need help, resource, let me know. I'll send out the slides, the recording, and the notes. And yeah, and this was live streamed in the group. I cut it off, I think, 45 minutes ago, though. So the first part. So anyways, all right, well, have a wonderful day. Take care of yourself. Love yourself. Do some self-care tonight, and I'll talk to you next Tuesday, right? No more Monday calls. We've consolidated, so we'll talk to you next Tuesday. All right. Thank you, everybody, for sharing in your vulnerability.